At the tender age of 11, she was married off to a wealthy imam who already had 3 wives. Recounting these events brings tears to my eyes. No child should ever have to endure this kind of hardship. Children are children, they should not be forced to play the role of adults. In the quiet town of Arzan in northern Morocco, people still speak in hushed tones about Halima, a tale of innocence lost, of childhood crushed under the weight of adult demands. Arzan, with its rolling hills and ancient alleys, is where her story unfolds. Nature. She was close to her brothers, especially her youngest brother Amin, who was only 2 years younger than her. The two shared an unbreakable bond, spending hours exploring the countryside, finding hidden paths and secret spots. She loved the smell of the soil, the rustle of the leaves, and the endless expanse of the fields that seemed to promise endless freedom. For her, Arzan was the whole world, a place where she felt safe and loved. But as Helma grew older, she began to notice that life in Arzan held limitations, particularly for girls. Her mother, though respected for her herbal knowledge, was rarely seen in public gatherings and often remained in the background, tending to the family and her work quietly. Helma saw that her future, too, seemed predetermined, tied to the family traditions and expectations of the community. Yet, she held on to her childhood dreams, believing that perhaps one day, she would make her own path. Helma's innocence, her spirit, and her family's love defined her early years. But these years of quiet contentment and simple joys would be short-lived. Unbeknownst to her, fate was preparing to take her down a path that would challenge everything she knew and test the strength of her spirit in ways she could never have imagined. The first time Sheikh Ibrahim. Children he had seen in the city often seemed bold and distracted. Halima, however, appeared focused, disciplined, and, in his eyes, unusually beautiful for her age. There was something about her innocence, her unguarded nature, that stirred an interest in him. Initially, Halima's parents didn't think much of the imam's attention toward their daughter. They were grateful for his visit and eager to help him with whatever he needed. But as the days passed, Sheikh Ibrahim found reasons to return to their home. Sometimes, he would request more medicine, other times, he would simply come to visit under the pretense of needing advice on health matters. Each time, he would engage in conversation with Maryam, but his gaze would linger on Halima. Yusuf and Maryam, still respectful of his status and unsure of his intentions, felt honored by his visits. For them, it was a matter of pride to host a man of such high religious standing. Yet in the background, Halima began to sense his unusual interest. She noticed the way he looked at her, the questions he asked her parents about her daily life, her work with her mother, and even her dreams. The attention made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't fully understand why. Lima's fate was sealed, her childhood exchanged for promises that would ultimately bring only sorrow and tragedy. Once Halima's parents accepted Sheikh Ibrahim's proposal, the entire household was thrown into a flurry of preparations. The upcoming wedding became the talk of Arzan, a spectacle of both excitement and unease. While child marriages were not unheard of, few had expected such a union between an 11-year-old village girl and an imam from the city. For Halima, the days leading up to the wedding were filled with confusion, dread, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. She watched as her family bustled about making arrangements, as if she were merely a spectator in her own life. Her mother, Maryam, tried to reassure her, though her own heart was heavy. Maryam sewed Halima's wedding dress by hand, selecting a simple yet elegant fabric, a modest white cloth trimmed with delicate embroidery. She had made dresses before, but this one felt different. With every stitch, she wrestled with her fears, hoping that her daughter would find happiness, or at the very least, comfort in the life ahead. She whispered quiet words to Halima about womanhood and duty, but her reassurances felt hollow even to her. Deep down, she knew Halima was not ready for the path she was about to walk. Meanwhile, Yusuf focused on practical matters, negotiating with local merchants for the wedding preparations. Arranging such an advantageous marriage, while others whispered among themselves, wondering if they were making a mistake.
Some even expressed concern for Halima, though no one dared to voice these concerns openly. For Halima, the gifts and preparations were bewildering and frightening. Each new item that arrived reminded her of what was coming, and each piece of jewelry placed on her tiny wrists felt like a shackle. She had no desire for gold or perfumes, she only wanted to stay with her family, to remain a child a little while longer. Her brothers noticed her unease, especially Amin, her closest sibling, who sensed her sorrow but didn't know how to comfort her. He tried to distract her with small jokes and familiar games, but even he couldn't lift the heavy silence that had settled over her. The wedding day finally arrived. Sheikh Ibrahim, dressed in lavish robes, arrived with an entourage, bringing with him a sense of authority and opulence that felt out of place in the humble village. He greeted Yusuf and Maryam with formal respect, his demeanor a mixture of pride. To live in silence, her days spent caring for her children and managing the household according to Sheikh Ibrahim's strict orders. She rarely ventured outside without his permission, and she raised her children to be obedient, instilling in them the same deference that had defined her own life. The second wife, Aisha, had once been spirited and hopeful, drawn to the Imam by the promises of a stable life and a sense of purpose. But Aisha's vivacity had been worn down over the years by the demands of living under his authority. She had entered the marriage with dreams of contributing to the community, of working alongside her husband, perhaps teaching or helping the less fortunate. Yet Sheikh Ibrahim had no interest in her ambitions. To him, Aisha's place was within the home, raising his children and supporting him without question. Over time, her spirit faded, her dreams slowly suffocating under the weight of her husband's control. By the time Hela entered the household, Aisha was a shadow of her former self, her once bright eyes now dulled with resignation. The third wife, Zainab, was younger and had been married. Sheikh Ibrahim confided in religion as both a source of comfort and a tool for control. He was deeply knowledgeable, but his interpretation of faith was rigid, leaving little room for empathy or understanding. In his eyes, his household was a model of religious adherence, a structure where his authority was absolute. He used religious texts to justify his actions, believing that his strict approach was in line with divine will. To him, his wives and children were not individuals with their own desires and dreams but rather extensions of himself, bound to follow the path he set for them. The decision to marry Halima, an 11-year-old girl, was not driven by love or companionship. For Sheikh Ibrahim, it was. Sheikh Ibrahim saw religion as both a source of comfort and a tool for control. He was deeply knowledgeable, but his interpretation of faith was rigid, leaving little room for empathy or understanding. In his eyes, his household was a model of religious adherence, a structure where his authority was absolute. He used religious texts to justify his actions, believing that his strict approach was in line with divine will. To him, his wives and children were not individuals with their own desires and dreams but rather extensions of himself, bound to follow the path he set for them. The decision to marry Halima, an 11-year-old girl, was not driven by love or companionship. For Sheikh Ibrahim, it was a matter of pride and desire, a way to assert his status and fulfill his wishes. Halima's youth and innocence held a strange allure for him, something he saw as both a testament to his influence and a fulfillment of his own. Isa was warmer, though equally constrained by her own experiences. She treated Halima like a younger sister, sharing whispered words of advice and caution when they were alone. Isa understood the struggles Halima faced, and though she could not openly defy the Imam, she offered Halima small moments of kindness, brief reprieves from the oppressive atmosphere of the household. She warned Halima of the Imam's temper, telling her to remain silent to avoid drawing attention to herself, to survive by submitting as they all had learned to do. For Isa, seeing Halima's pain was a reminder of her own crushed dreams, and while she wished for something better for the young girl, she felt powerless to change anything. Zab, the third wife, was more outspoken and occasionally rebellious, though her defiance was carefully controlled. She saw Halima's innocence and youth as a stark contrast to the life they led, and it filled her with a simmering anger. Zab was resentful of the Imam and his authority, and though she did not openly challenge him, she did not hide her disdain from Halima. She would sometimes take Halima aside and speak harshly of the life they were forced to endure.
And the warm embrace of her mother's kitchen, she longed for the days when she had been free, when her life was filled with familiar routines and the gentle presence of her family. But now, those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She struggled to reconcile the reality of her new life with the innocence she had left behind, and a deep sadness settled within her. She prayed silently, hoping that somehow her suffering would end, though she had no clear idea of how or when. As the weeks turned into months, Hela's spirit grew quieter, her voice softer, and her will weaker. She moved through her days like a shadow, performing her duties without complaint, her mind numbed by the repetitive tasks and the constant fear of displeasing the Imam. She had come to understand that there was no escape, no reprieve from the life she had been thrust into. She was no longer a child, she had been transformed into something else, a young girl forced into the role of a wife in a world that showed her little kindness and even less mercy. In her darkest moments, Hela would sit alone, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts filled with memories of her family. She wondered if they missed her, if they regretted the choice they had made, or if they too had accepted her absence as part of the price for their own survival. Each night, as she lay in the cold silence of her room, she would whisper a prayer, a plea for freedom, though she did not know what that freedom would look like. All she knew was that the life she had been given was a life she could barely endure. And so, each day, she drifted further into silence. Their quiet gestures of empathy were a reminder that Halma was not alone in her suffering, but it was a small comfort in the face of her growing hopelessness. One evening, as Halma lay awake, her thoughts drifted to memories of her mother's herbal teachings, and an idea began to form. She remembered the plants her mother had shown her, the ones used for ailments but also those that could harm if used improperly. Her mother had taught her how certain herbs, when combined, could become dangerous, even lethal. Halma's mind lingered on this knowledge, a knowledge she had never thought she would need in such a way. But desperation was a powerful force, and as the days wore on, the thought grew stronger, taking root in her heart. It was terrifying yet oddly empowering, a glimmer of control in a life where she had none. Over the next few weeks, Halma began to carefully collect the necessary. But this time, she added the deadly mixture she had carefully crafted, stirring it into the cup with a steady hand. She moved with an uncanny calm, her face expressionless, her eyes focused on the task at hand. As she carried the tea to him, her heart pounded, but her resolve remained unshaken. She placed the cup in front of him, her hands steady, her gaze fixed downward to avoid betraying any hint of her intentions. Sheikh Ibrahim took the cup without a second thought, sipping the tea as he often did, unaware of the poison that lingered within. Helma watched from a distance, her breathing shallow as she waited for the effects to take hold. She had anticipated this moment for so long, rehearsed it in her mind until it felt almost surreal. As she observed him, a sense of numbness settled over her, a detachment from the act she had just committed. For the first time since her marriage, she felt a strange, twisted sense of freedom, though she knew it would be short-lived. But then something shifted within her, a realization of the enormity of what she had done. She felt a surge of fear, a dread of what would come next. The village would surely learn of the Imam's death, and she, the young bride, would be the first to fall under suspicion. The thought of facing the judgment of her people sent a chill down her spine. Young bride. 2 lives had ended in the same night. What darkness had touched them so suddenly? Inside the house, the scene was stark and haunting. Sheikh Ibrahim's body lay motionless, his face frozen in an expression of shock and pain, evidence of the poison's cruel effect. Next to him lay Halima, her small form curled up as if in sleep, her face bearing a calmness that belied the turmoil of her last days. Her hands were clasped over her chest, and for a moment, she looked like a child resting peacefully. But to those who knew the truth, it was clear this was no peaceful end, it was the final act of a girl who had been pushed beyond her limits. The wives gathered around, each responding in her own way. Fatima, the oldest, knelt beside Halima's lifeless body, silent tears streaming down her face. She had known the suffering of a young bride all too well and had seen Halima's innocence fade. Against the unquestioned practices that had defined their lives, Halima's short life would not be easily forgotten. Her final act had stirred something within the community, planting a seed of doubt that would grow over time, challenging the very foundations upon which Aram's customs were built. For the women of the village, especially the wives and daughters, Halima's story became a whispered tale of resilience and quiet rebellion. Mothers began to question the futures they had planned for their daughters, and young girls looked to Halima's memory as a reminder of their own desires for freedom. Though she was gone, Halima's spirit had left a mark, a legacy that lived on as a silent challenge to the ways of old. She had taken control of her fate in the only way she could. Halima's story became a whispered tale of resilience and quiet rebellion. Mothers began to question the futures they had planned for their daughters, and young girls looked to Hela's memory as a reminder of their own desires for freedom. Though she was gone, Hela's spirit had left a mark, a legacy that lived on as a silent challenge to the ways of old. She had taken control of her fate in the only way she could, and in doing so, had left an unspoken call for change that the people of Arzan could no longer ignore.